Welcome back to, this is part 3 of Walls of Flames by Gerard Schultz. When we left off, I was reading to you about the inland fires in connection with the Michigan fires that swept the state in 1881. And we will continue with, meanwhile, 30 miles to the southwest, the fires between Vassar and Carroll burned fiercely and much property was destroyed. In the vicinity of Vassar, 18 persons saved their lives by staying in wells on Monday, September 5th. The Vassar Times of September 8 stated that the fire of 1871 was a bonfire compared to the fire of 1881. A vivid account of the horrors of the fire was published in the Minden Post of September 10, 1881. The darkness that prevailed at Minden has been described earlier. The account continues. As the fire neared the village, the atmosphere became lurid, seeming to be filled with flames. A strong wind had been blowing from the southwest and increased by 3 o'clock to almost a hurricane. The air became so hot that leaves on trees were cooked while the fire was yet a mile distant. Strong-hearted men were in despair. Women were frantic, many fainting, and others imploring their protectors to take them to the shore as the only place of safety. A number started for Forestville, but when they reached Charleston, the village was in a mass of flames, and they were compelled to return and proceed to White Rock. Most of the people remained in Minden, however, and fought the flames with the determination of those who struggle for life. Sheets of flame were flying in every direction, and incipient fires were extinguished in all parts of the village. At last, when the fire had reached the outskirts of Minden, there came a lull in the hurricane. At different places opposing winds clashed. One of these places was near Minden, where a strong wind coming from the southwest met head-on with a forceful wind coming from the northwest. Their struggle for mastery made a terrible noise, like the roaring of mighty waters. The people became greatly alarmed and did not know what next would follow. The northwest current was the strongest and drove the southwest wind back. Fortunate for the people of Minden was the interaction of these winds, as it served to turn the fire away from them. The account in the Minden Post continues. By 6 o'clock, people began coming into Minden from the west, having barely escaped with their lives, and when morning arrived, hundreds had found their way here in a half-nude condition, burned and blinded by the smoke. We then began to have a faint realization of the extent of the fire. Then we first understood that not property alone, but human lives had been swallowed up too. To the west and north, the roads were lined with the carcasses of horses, cattle, sheep, swine, and poultry, etc., cooked and charred almost to a crisp. Then human beings alike, burned and charred, were found. Some were still alive, with their feet, hands, and faces literally baked. Some had their ears and nose burned off, and their eyes almost burned out of their sockets. It's too horrible to contemplate for even a moment. Meanwhile, the sufferers kept pouring into Minden, and our village was turned into a general hospital and boarding house, with all of our generous citizens acting in the capacity of unpaid keepers and attendants. In Huron County, a Mr. Lyman lay helplessly in bed with typhoid fever. His wife took her baby and a small son to a swamp, where they stayed all night. They suffered burns, but survived, and were fortunate indeed, because many swamps burned fiercely. Bailey quotes an anonymous writer as saying, "Dark and gloomy swamps filled with pools of stagnant water, and the home for years of wildcats, bears, and snakes, were struck and shriveled and burned almost in a flash." One son had stayed with his father, and the next morning both father and son were found dead near the place their home had been. Some days after the fire, the remains of a mother and her 5 children were found in the forest. The mother was in a kneeling position with hands of her 5 children in her lap, and all burned to a crisp. As in most disasters, and at times of crises, many people rose to the challenge and showed heroic qualities. The home of Chris Myers of Lincoln Township in Huron County was completely surrounded by windfalls. At the time the walls of flames came racing toward his home, he was working in Port Austin, and his wife had gone to a neighbor's house. Margaret, age 11, was the eldest of the children at home. Unexcited, she took the baby in her arms and told the other children to follow her, and then they went along the narrow path to a clearing. Several times their clothing caught fire, but each time Margaret would put out the flame. The house burned down, but the lives of all the children were saved. Margaret did not understand why people looked upon her as a heroine. Another act of heroism was carried out by John Oberski of Paris Township, who, on seeing the fire approaching, placed his sick wife and a child about 2 weeks old, together with his 4 other children and 3 children of his brother-in-law, in a wagon, and hitching a yoke of oxen to it, attempted to reach an opening about 1.5 miles distant. They had already started when the oxen became frightened and broke away, leaving the sick wife and 8 children to be taken care of by one man. However, Mr. Oberski was equal to the emergency. He took his wife with his infant in one arm, the youngest of the other children on the other, and instructing the remaining 7 to keep close to him, he made a dash for life. Burdened as he was in having to watch the children following him, he succeeded in reaching the open space. The fire came so close that they were temporarily blinded, but all their lives were spared. H. Story of Sanilac County was away from home on this horrible Monday, but hurried back to save his family. As he approached the house in a blinding smoke, he stumbled over an object which he thought was a hog. When he seized it to throw it aside, he made a terrible discovery that it was one of his children, suffocated and burned. A few feet away lay his wife and another dead child. The village of Charleston, formerly known as Cato, consisting of a score of houses, a sawmill, a store, and several small shops, was entirely destroyed by the fire. Ubley and Tyre were destroyed. 32 lives were lost in Argyle. On September 6th, the village of Clio was entirely surrounded by fire. At the same time, about 15 miles to the northeast, the village of Millington was seriously threatened by it. At these and other places, the fire was fought with water, backfiring, whipping, and plowing. The Robinson family near Cedar Springs escaped the oncoming fire by getting in a buggy, traveling over a long stretch of corduroy at a gallop, the fire hissing and cracking on all sides, singeing the horse's mane. The smoke blinded them, and the heat caused intense pain to them. They reached Millington, but for a time they were unable to give any intelligible account of their experiences. The fire was extremely destructive in northern Lapeer County. Numerous houses and barns were consumed by the flames. Cattle, hogs, sheep, poultry, hay, grain, stacks, and unharvested crops burned. Several persons lost their lives. Many fires were reported in counties west of Tuscola and Lapeer counties. Great damage was done to the fences and in places to green pine forest. Here and there mills, houses, barns, and other buildings burned. Damage done by the fires in St. Clair County was chiefly confined to fences and forests. On Wednesday night, September 7th, relief finally came. A heavy rain fell, which extinguished most of the fires that were still burning. The outlook for the survivors was not entirely bad. Many had lost loved ones, and many more had lost their homes and their personal belongings, but for those who were willing to and able to stay and work for the future, thousands of acres of land had been cleared for planting of crops. Less than 1 month after the fire, green wheat was growing on land cleared by it. This same land was so severely ravished by the terrible walls of flame, has yielded bountiful crops, and has been good to those who stayed with it. Places of safety. Many persons went into wells for protection against the fire. In the vicinity of Vassar, 18 persons saved their lives by staying in wells on Monday, the worst day of the fire. A number of persons died in wells of suffocation. 7 persons died in a well at Richmondville. 4 miles west of Forestville, Sylvester Richmond's house caught fire. In an 8-foot well about 150 feet from the house, there was about 2 feet of water. Mr. Richmond placed his wife and 6 children in this, then fought the fire until the heat could no longer be endured, when he himself took refuge in the well. The wind tore the roof off the house and dropped it over the well. The entire family died of suffocation. One man clung to the stones in a well with his fingers and toes for 24 hours. The irony of it was that when the fire and smoke went away, he discovered that he was only 2 feet from the bottom and that the well was dry. Many persons fled to tracts of cleared land where they scooped holes in the ground and buried their faces in them to escape inhaling the smoke. Some covered their bodies with soil. In a number of these open spaces, wild animals, domestic animals, and human beings were together, not showing hostility towards each other, only fear of the fire. Green cornfields were used as places of safety. People living near the shore of Lake Huron took refuge in the lake, waiting out until only their heads were above the water. A number of people living near Cass River took refuge in it. One woman, crazed by the fire, started to run directly into it. Her husband, with great difficulty, prevented her from doing so. The people spent most of the night in the river, wetting their clothes to keep them from being burned by the flames which rolled over them from the shore. The water became so hot that fish died by the hundreds. Freaks. The forest fire of September 1881 was not without freaks. At one place the fire ran within 3 feet of a wheat stack and then glided away and burned a house. Near Parisville, a rick of hay and the surrounding rail fence escaped destruction, but the farmer's house, barns, stables, and fences were completely destroyed. On some farms, the houses burned but not the barn, and on other farms the barn burned but not the house. One man removed all his household goods and other effects out into a field. They were buried, but the house was not. They were burned, but the house was not. In Sanilac County, the fire divided as it came close to an old, unoccupied log cabin. However, after it had passed the cabin, it ran together again. At Minden, a southwest wind tore off a part of a barn roof, carrying it more than 1,000 feet northwestward. The other part of the same roof was caught by the northwest wind, carrying it almost 2,000 feet southeastward. At Forest Bay in Huron County, winds struck the barn on the farm of John Hobson. First the barn was unroofed, and then an ash rafter, which was about 30 feet long and 6 inches square and spiked down, was removed by the wind, which then drove it under a board fence with such force that Mr. Hobson failed to pull it out with a yoke and oxen. Most villages saved. Most of the villages were not burned by the fire. Along Lake Huron, these included Grindstone City, Sandy Beach, White Rock, Forester, Port Sanilac, and Lexington. Along Saginaw Bay, the wind came from the west. It was not a violent wind, but it was strong enough to keep the fire away from the bay. As a result, the fire did not enter the villages of Bear Grove, Akron, Unionville, Sebelwing, and Caseville. A north wind kept the fire out of Port Austin. Cass City, Carroll, Vassar, Millington, and Clio were able to fight off the fire. Clashing winds, as previously described, saved Minden. The sale of goods and stores in these villages declined. At Sand Beach, the Huron Times of September 22, 1881, stated that it is true beyond question that the vast amounts of supplies sent to our stricken neighbors will hurt the business of merchants and mechanics for a time. Later, much of the relief was on a cash basis. And we'll stop here, and I will be back with you with part 4 and the conclusion in the next video. Thanks for stopping by.